And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you so much for joining us once again. And it's great to have Stephen Meyer join us once again. He was with us, I think it was more or less exactly a year ago. Stephen, thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Well, thanks for having me back.
It's a nice start to last year. I'm sure it was more or less exactly the same date last year. So great to have you back. And of course, people can find you. That is your Twitter handle. A director of Center for Science and Culture of the at the Discovery Institute, author of a number of books, and of course, Return of the God Hypothesis is your latest book out me 3 years ago, and I've been delving into. Was telling Stephen that my wife has been reading this, and she has nudged me and passed it across. So I've picked it up. Fascinating, covering all different areas, and I know we touched on some of them on the last interview. But I wanted to kind of go back and ask you about this clash that we hear about, and it pervades not only the media but our education, political discourse, everything. And there's that clash between religion and science, or faith and science, maybe. And it seems to be a kind of a fabricated, made up clash. Do you want to just maybe we can start with that, because it's a way of dismissing any talk of an intelligent designer from the outset?
Right. It's a great way of framing the discussion. The idea that there's an inherent conflict between science and religion, or science and a specific religion like Christianity, is a kind of media trope, and it's something that you hear reprised over and over and over again. And yet, I think the reality is quite the reverse. And one of the ways I try to get at that in my book, Return to the God Hypothesis, is start with some history, and some history of science in particular. And I look at the period of the scientific revolution and show the profound influences from both Christianity and from Judaism and the Hebrew Bible in giving rise to that remarkable period of scientific innovation and creativity, with figures like uh, Kepler and Galileo and Copernicus, but especially in the whole tradition of British natural theology, which begins with figures like Robert Boyle, the great chemist, John Ray, the founder of botany, and eventually finding its apogee, if you will, in the work of Isaac Newton. But then others following on even into the 19th century. When you do get conflict over biological origins with Darwin, you still in physics have people like Lord Kelvin, and most astonishingly, I think, the work of James Clerk Maxwell, who when Einstein visited Cambridge, he was asked if he stood on the shoulders of giants in the same way that Newton did, and people asked him about Newton, and of course he gave a hat tip to the great Sir Isaac, but he said, and especially James Clerk Maxwell was someone whose work made possible everything that came later. So you may remember that Maxwell was at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge. He had the great door inscribed with a psalm in Latin, but the translation is Psalm 111 is, great are the works of the Lord, sought out by all who take pleasure therein. And for him, this was the inspiration for doing science. There was even there was a great book recently called For the Glory of God by the historian of science, Rodney Stark. And it was published with Princeton University Press. And it is a history of the scientific revolution, and talking about the religious motivation of the great scientists who got Western science going.
Have we seen a change? Certainly in Europe, there's been a massive pullback and removal of Christianity from the public space, where at one point it was Christian to engage in society, whether or not it was institutions of health and medicine, or education or anything else, but just participating. And we seem to have come. I don't know whether it's because we've become a society which is more selfish, maybe focused on ourselves, together with that, we see um, church is not really teaching the benefit or encouraging Christians to actively engage in society as their Christian duty for society. Is that a fair assessment of me where we are?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we can critique secularist critiques of the history of science and point out that they're inaccurate in the way that they've portrayed the role of religious belief and of Christianity and of the relationship between science and Christianity. But I think there's also a critique to be made of the broader Christian church or movement. I can speak more to the way that's unfolded in the United States. Historians of our country, historians and sociologists of religion, refer to the fundamentalist modernist split that occurred in this country roughly in the 1920s, about the time of the Scopes trial. And the idea is that as you had in the late 19th century these intellectual influences that were affirming more of a naturalistic worldview than a theistic one. You think of figures like Darwin, who's formulates a theory of origins, which it relies strictly on natural processes and eliminates the need to invoke a designing mind or intelligence of any kind. You think of figures like Marx, who had a utopian, materialistic or naturalistic vision of the future. Freud in psychology, who tells us about the human condition and what to do about our guilt. You have these great secular thinkers who provide the basis for formulating a kind of comprehensive secular and naturalistic worldview. And in reaction to that, I think many Christians the historians of religion in this country have pointed out that Christians reacted in two kind of diametrically opposed ways. Some said, well, if science properly understood or broadly understood points us to naturalism or materialism as a worldview or atheism, then we're not going to do science. We're not going to sully ourselves by being involved with such a godless enterprise. And others said, well, if science is the way to go, then we've got to get on board with that, including the scientific materialist worldview that denied the possibility of miracles and so forth. And so that led to a denial of any transcendent realm of reality, a transcendent God who could act in history. And so you ended up with something like the old Jefferson Bible reprised, where Christians denied the miraculous. And I think many Jewish thinkers, rabbis, got into this as well. So there's a Jewish rabbi here in the States, in Los Angeles, who preaches a sermon every year at Passover time, explaining that the Exodus never happened, and you have Christian pastors and theologians denying the resurrection and things like that. So you get what ends up resulting is what's sometimes called the social gospel, where you have Christianity merely on a horizontal plane, where there's a denial of the miraculous and denial of a transcendent God who could act in a miraculous way. It just becomes a kind of almost secularized ethical system. And so you have, on the one hand, a withdrawal from culture altogether, and on the other hand, an embrace of it to the extent that it ends up denying basic tenets, where that embrace ends up denying basic tenets of traditional Christianity and Judaism as well. So you either way, the public square becomes, as Richard Don Newhouse put it, naked. There's no religious influence anymore in the public square. Christians who still believe biblical truth have withdrawn. Christians who have decided they don't believe what Christians have traditionally believed are still engaged, but without any impact, because they've become just mirrors of the culture.
Talking about culture and culture wars, and in moments I don't mean to talk politically, but there has been that, especially over life and sexuality and family, but the issue of intelligent design, or a god above us and bigger than us, that hasn't seemed to have been part. Somehow we're kind of told that's settled, and that's not a conversation that's needed. Where some of the other issues, certainly over gender and life, it seems to be hotly debated. Um, Talked about that, about how this can and is becoming part of that debate. I mean, I remember when you were on Rogan, and that means bringing this conversation that then becomes part of a much larger debate.
Well, I think I think the discussion of the God question needn't become a lightning rod in a culture war. I think in some way the underlying worldview divide between theists and naturalists is the fundamental source of what sociologists like James Davidson Hunter and others have called the culture war. That many of these issues, take the issue of life, of abortion. Um, if you're a theist, and indeed a roughly biblically believing theist of some kind, you're going to be inclined to view life as a consequence of God's creative activity, that there is a intrinsic value to human life that begins um, well before birth, and so there's going to be, if a theist or Christian or Jew is engaged with if they are taking their worldview seriously and they want to engage with the culture, they're going to naturally want to contend for the value of human life, and that's going to become a political, socio-political issue, and it's derivative of a deeper worldview that they hold. Conversely, if you're a materialist, you're going to be more inclined to view the fetus as maybe a potential life, but a clump of cells. You're going to view it through a materialistic lens, and so abortion isn't going to be seen um, as morally consequential. And so you've got a clash over a political issue that and a social issue that is derivative of a deeper worldview. But I think what's interesting that's happening right now is that the deeper worldview question itself is coming into focus in the culture. And you have a lot of figures, particularly in your country, who are rethinking, at the very least, the importance of Christianity for culture. We've, after all, even had Richard Dawkins say he's now willing to say he's a cultural Christian. Of course, he's still very clear that he's an atheist and is not saying he believes it. But other figures like Tom Holland, who are saying, in a way, we're all swimming in Christian waters, that the concern for the disenfranchised, for the marginalized, for minorities, for women, for people who are on the outside looking in, is actually a Christian concern. We go back to the formation of many Western institutions, many Western ways of thought. And I think his work is so interesting because he was an ancient historian, and he found that something radically changed in the first, second, third centuries in the West. If you look at the Persians and the Assyrians and the Greeks and the Romans, these were empires that were characterized by a great deal of cruelty. And then suddenly you have this concern for widows and orphans and disenfranchised peoples, and you have the hospital movement, which is a Christian movement. You have the idea of universal human rights, all these things. And so anyway, I think there are figures like Tom Holland, and Jordan Peterson and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Niall Ferguson, and it could go on. I wrote a piece in the Jerusalem Post in 2018 eulogizing the great physicist Steven Weinberg. But in my eulogy to him as a great physicist, I also pointed out that he was in some ways the last of the strident new atheists. That the new atheist movement that seems so strong in the early aughts, in '06, '07, '08, with the publication of The God Delusion and other books, God's Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, these figures, that this movement was running out of steam. There had been a great deal of internal infighting, but also the arguments seemed to be wearing thin with people. And there was, by 1920, a number of figures who were saying, I can't quite get myself over the line to belief myself, but I think we maybe have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And some of those same figures are now embracing faith. Others are still saying, hey, I can't quite get there myself, but Christianity has played a really important role in culture, and we're at a loss to find a replacement for that. Neither wokeness nor scientific atheism is filling that void.
whenever that wave happened, nearly 20 years ago now, with many of those books, how did you respond? Those in your field, you see these arguments pushed by the media and accepted by many, and maybe even churches beginning to buy into this. Well, we can't be so sure. We can't be so dogmatic. We need a Christianity of doubt instead of certainty.
Yeah, right, right.
How did what were the conversation like with you and fellow colleagues whenever that wave happened on how to respond to that? Or is it just a case of, well, you keep doing what you're doing and keep producing where the evidence lies?
Well, I'm grateful to these guys because they have a real uh, penchant for framing issues in an engaging way. And Dawkins has famously said, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Where blind, pitiless indifference is his shorthand for undirected material processes. And his denial of design, which lay at the root of his affirmation of atheism. I remember he is also famously quoted as saying that Darwin made it possible to become an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Why? Because Darwin denied the need for a designing intelligence of any kind to account for the complexity of life. Prior to Darwin, the complexity, the integrated complexity of life was seen as a powerful argument for a powerful public evidence-based argument for the reality of a designing intelligence and indeed a deity. And so Darwin is a key figure for Dawkins and the New Atheists, and their claim that Darwin eliminated the need to invoke design and undermined any evidential basis for a design hypothesis actually propelled us, and me specifically, that when the New Atheist books were coming out, I was writing a prospectus for my first book, Signature in the Cell, and I cited not only their movement, but their rationale. And their rationale was precisely the idea that given that there's no evidence of design in nature, we can be intellectually fulfilled atheists, and anyone who affirms the opposite can continue, if they wish, to hold a belief in God in the same manner that someone would believe in fairies, but they can't do so on the basis of any evidence. They can't do so on the basis of any, they can not do so with any intellectual credibility. And so in saying with those of us who are arguing that the cutting edge science, in particular in biology, is now pointing to the reality of a designing mind, we were, in a sense, directly countering the premise that drove the new atheism. And the Harper, the publisher who took on my first book and has published my two subsequent books, I think were quite intrigued with the way in which our work was directly engaging that key scientific atheist premise. They made us relevant in a way that maybe we wouldn't have been without them. So hat tip to them for raising the big questions in the public square. I give another hat tip, and that would be to Justin Brierley and his new book, The Surprising Rediscovery of Belief in God. And he tells the story of the demise of the new atheism and how it's unraveled since about roughly 2014. Part of that has to do with internal disagreements between the new atheists about moral and social issues, which I think is in some way was inevitable, because if you deny a transcendent source of moral order or moral guidance, and each person is left to himself or herself to decide what is or is not ethically important, you're going to end up with there's a relativism that is associated with atheism that will end up in these kinds of irreconcilable differences over. In some cases, a lot of this had to do with the cultural Marxist ideology and to what degree atheists should either reject it or affirm it, and that was a lot of the disagreements. But in addition, I don't think the scientific arguments of the new atheists have stood up very well. They didn't really engage the cutting edge arguments for design. The arguments in Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, were really thin from a scientific and philosophical point of view. And a lot of people, besides those of us in the intelligent design research community, have pointed that out. So I think their intellectual case was weaker than presented, and there was infighting. And the two things together, I think, have meant that the new atheism is now pretty much a spent force. And you have what I've been calling the new atheism, or the not quite Christianism, emerging, where people are saying, maybe we better rethink this God question, and they're doing so in the public arena, which I think is extremely interesting.
No, it is. You part of the book. Step back a little bit again. I think in chapter 11, you talk about one of your first experiences back in 2000, in a large public arena of presenting intelligent design. Um, Tell us what that was like, and then kind of how that journey, that not breakneck journey because it's step by step, but yeah, let us know what that was like to stand in an auditorium and do a presentation, something which maybe wasn't really discussed. Social media was not around to carry a message, or it was a different time.
Right, right. It seems not to be that long ago to me, but of course, a lot's changed since 2000. There was a seminal conference that was held at Baylor University in Texas, and it featured several Nobel laureates, and it was framed around and many other really fine scientists, and it was framed around the question. The title was "The Nature of Nature," and it was framed around the question of whether nature is pointing beyond itself to another reality, or whether the close study of nature affirms that nature is as it were, self-contained, eternal, self-existent, self-creating, and self-organizing as a system. And so you had roughly the divide between theism and naturalism, represented by top-level academics, philosophers of science, and scientists. And I remember, I was fairly early on in the development of my case for intelligent design. I'd had one or two significant essays published, but nothing by way of a full book-length treatment. I was still at a very small liberal arts college, so I was not draped in academic authority at that point. Many would say I'm still not, so no worries there. But in any case, I was sort of new to all of this, and I had to give a presentation based on my somewhat based on my PhD research. I did my PhD at Cambridge on the subject of origin of life biology, and it continued to develop my thinking about that, and was beginning to develop a positive case for intelligent design based on the information bearing properties of DNA, the information that would be necessary to explain the origin of the first life. And I was paired at the conference opposite Christian de Duve, who is a Nobel laureate. Well, he's now passed away. Lovely man, Belgian Nobel Prize-winning biochemist who'd written several important books on the origin of life. And I gave my talk right before him. The way the conference was set up, I had an opposite number before me, and then after me. I was wedged between two people who had different points of view. But I was particularly interested in and maybe nervous about what de Duve would say about my talk. And so I gave a talk about the current thinking about the origin of life, the different problems associated with, in particular, this problem of the origin of biological information. How do we get from chemistry to code? And I showed that each of the approaches to this had essentially reached a point of impasse from within a naturalistic framework, including de Duve's own approach. And then at the end, I argued that that whereas chance and necessity and the combination of the two, natural laws and random processes, were not giving an adequate account of the origin of information. Information was, in our experience, a mind product, and therefore could be explained as the product of intelligent agency. And I gave an argument for that was something that drew on some of the work I'd done in my PhD thesis. De Duve got up and was immediately, to my shock, complimentary about the talk, and said that he had agreed with the previous speaker, except for that last slide. So he wasn't quite ready to go to, in fact, he was not ever going to go to intelligent design, but he entirely affirmed the critique that I had made of origin of life research. And over dinner that night, we had an extremely nice conversation. He complimented my knowledge of molecular biology because I am by training a philosopher of biology, and he was a bit surprised by that. But I've been working on origin of life questions, and you can't avoid the molecular stuff. So that was, to me, very affirming. But what happened in each of these sessions, we had one of my colleagues, Bruce Gordon, was paired against Steven Weinberg in discussing the fine-tuning evidence in physics. William Lane Craig was paired opposite Alan Guth from MIT. So we all felt ourselves, really having been thrown into the deep end in this conference. And afterwards, we ended up having a conversation with several of us who were on the theistic side, and had the realization that the other side of the argument, that people that we greatly respected but with whom we profoundly disagreed, were acknowledging the very same problems that we saw, and which were part of the reason that we were considering an alternative point of view as to how to explain these key discoveries in science about the origin of the universe, about its fine-tuning, about the origin of the information that's necessary to build living systems, about the origin of molecular machines. So all of these key issues that ID proponents have been addressing were discussed at this conference. And I think it was seminal for many of us because we realized that the great giants on the other side of the argument had to put their pants on one leg at a time, and they were as perplexed and in some ways flummoxed by these great discoveries as we would have thought, that naturalism didn't really explain the fine-tuning of the universe. The multiverse wasn't really a very satisfying explanation. Quantum cosmology, which was just being formulated, didn't really seem to cut it for the origin of the universe, and so on. So anyway, it was kind of a confidence building experience for many of us because we were paired against really prominent figures in the field and found that our arguments held up quite well.
And how has that come from those conference centers 24 years ago to the public sphere? That's a step, and it's not automatic. It doesn't necessarily have to happen. It could stay within certain circle. How do you make that bridge across?
Well, in 2000, there were 3 or 4 key books that had been published, early books advancing the theory of intelligent design. One was Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box, which came out in '96. The other really important book was Bill Dembski's The Design Inference, which was published with Cambridge University Press in '98. There were a couple of others. In 04, 05, there was a court trial in the United States that was allegedly about the theory of intelligent design, but it was basically, there was a small school district in Western Pennsylvania who wanted students to learn that maybe Darwinism wasn't the whole story. And they asked, the school board passed a ill-conceived policy that required teachers to tell students that there was a book about the theory of intelligent design in the school library. Somewhat innocuous, but they imposed this on teachers as a mandate, which we oppose, and they did so on the basis of a really bad fact pattern, as the lawyers call it, in the school board meetings. One of the board members stood up and said that they needed to pass this piece of legislation for the crucified one. So they made an explicit statement of religious purpose as the basis of talking about this scientific idea. Well, we knew that wasn't going to fly in the courts. It wasn't the way to go for a whole bunch of reasons. We didn't really want to be involved in debates at the public school level about our theory, and so what happened was inevitable. It became a huge national case. There was lots of media about it. I was on a number of the talking head shows and that sort of thing, as were many of my colleagues. And what ended up happening was inevitable. The federal judge said that the policy was unconstitutional, and so the opponents of intelligent design, the scientific opponents, who were opposed to the work that we were doing, a la Dembski and Behe and others, said they had a motto. They said, "It's over after Dover." Intelligent design has gone the way of the Scopes trial. It's all done, done and dusted, as you guys say in your country. And so we kind of said, all right, well, in a way, this is a silver lining in this. We're out of the media limelight. We can get back to work, and um, we started a lot more scientific publishing. We'd been doing quite a lot. '04 was also the first year we had a peer-reviewed scientific article in a major science journal, and that also caused a lot of public controversy. This was the journal that the journal was edited at the time at the Smithsonian Institution, or it was published out of the Smithsonian Institution and edited by Richard Sternberg. It was an article that I happened to have written. And so we started publishing a lot more scientific articles. At that point, we had one major peer-reviewed publication. At this point, we have 295. But I had a series of books that were written for what are called high tone trade publishers, not quite popular books. I attempted to make the arguments very rigorous, but I attempted to write them in a style that would invite a wider audience. We also then in '08 had a documentary that was made about our work, headlined by Ben Stein, the famous American economist and comic. And so little by little, the two things started to happen in tandem, that our work was gaining more traction in the scientific world, but there were more and more events or media. There was just more media about it, and with the kind of creation of first talk radio and then social media, it became pretty easy to popularize the message of even fairly technical books by having authors on shows like your podcast. And we, in the 2009, 10, 11, American talk radio was still a force. You had huge programs with huge national audiences. So when I published Signature in the Cell, I did something like 250 talk radio interviews. This was even before podcasts were coming online. And now with podcasts, it's really possible to take a deep intellectual topic into the public arena and discuss it. So, and what we found is that many of those talk radio programs and podcasts have been geared towards political issues, but the public's actually hungry for deeper conversations about issues of more ultimate concern. And so when we've been on these very big shows, the producers will often come on after the interviews and say, boy, our board just light up. We had no idea there was so much interest. They're getting, if it's talk radio, massive number of calls and that sort of thing. They thought, the only thing the public cared about was politics. And it turns out not to be so.
No, absolutely. Another way, and you've got conference upcoming, is what, the 8th of February, your 7th annual conference. And that is another way, I guess, of how you can open it up. Maybe first of all, let people know why they should go watching, but then tell us how an event like that is used to, again, win people over. It's part of the wider discourse and helping people grasp and understand these issues, and I guess feel confident that they can take it and they can begin to have conversations with friends, family, and people around them.
Right. We have a 7th annual conference on science and faith that will be held in the Texas city of Dallas. We've had similar conferences in Cambridge, England, up in Scotland. We've had them in many cities around the United States, and the many people come from all over physically in attendance, but it will also be available over the internet to watch. Keep an eye out for announcements at our website, discovery.org. But conferences like this can bring top academic talent. We'll bring our top scientists in, especially the ones who are skilled in public presentation, and make talks on the different facets of this question about Darwinism and design, or questions about cosmology. We'll often have a different theme each year. This one, it's on all creatures great and small. I'm going to be giving a talk that's largely based on my second book, Darwin's Doubt, about the perplexing question of the origin of animal life. This has become a very acute question in the field of paleontology, because most of the major animal forms arise very abruptly in a period of biological creativity in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion. But there are also issues in the field of developmental biology about showing, we've learned more about literally the circuitry that's involved in coordinating the development of an animal from a fertilized egg. You go from embryo to fully adult animal. There's something called a developmental gene regulatory network that ensures that the right kinds of cells are built, and the right genes are turned on at the right times, and this whole beautiful choreographed process that, as it happens, does not lend itself to evolution. That if you start to alter the elements of those gene regulatory networks even a little bit, the animal will not develop properly and will die before it reaches a fully formed animal life. And so I'm going to be talking about that at this conference. So it's a fairly technical subject, but it's directly relevant to the Darwin design debate. And I've got a talk on it that can make this, I think, fairly clear and understandable. And we have other people talking about other biological systems, whether it's whales or butterflies. So that's the theme this time. We've done different subjects in different times. So these conferences have been a way to build an audience for our work. And in the era of the internet, these talks, James Tour did a talk on the origin of life several years ago that has close to 1 million views. I did one on cosmology, this same thing. One year we had Eric Metaxas, a radio host in the US, come, and he interviewed me about Return of the God hypothesis before it came out, and that's gotten several 100,000 views. So it's a great way to get our message out and to generate interest in these deep questions of biological and cosmological origins and what they tell us about the God question, if you will.
I just want to maybe end off with kind of what's really been in your mind or your focus recently. I think when we were on before, well, part of it, I mean, part two of your book, Return of the God Hypothesis, goes through. It can be the first part is looking at the universe, and there's a focus on that, and then the second part looks at DNA and the complexities of that. And I know I remember vividly discussing that with you when we looked signature in the cells, part of our interview before. But then for me, some of the areas I've been looking at, I've been blown away by the intrinsic composition of parts of the universe and how um, degrees either side makes it impossible. So looking at that, but for you, what is it that's really been your focus or excited you maybe most recently?
Well, I'm working on a scientific paper with a colleague, Brian Miller, who's a biophysicist or complex system physicist, about and with input from our colleague Douglas Axe, about proteins. Turns out that proteins are, in a sense, the fundamental unit of biological innovation. If you want to build a new structure in life, you've got to have proteins. And proteins and they do all the important jobs in the cell. They catalyze reactions at super fast rates. They build the structural parts of the miniature machines that we're finding in cells, whether it be the bacterial flagellar motor or the ATP synthase or any of these things. And they also are involved in processing the information on the DNA molecule. They're built from the information based on the instructions in DNA, but they're also necessary to process the instructions in DNA. So you have this classic closed loop, a chicken and egg problem. But at the most fundamental level, the question of the origin of proteins has a lot to do with how difficult it is to build them, and how difficult it would be to have a random assembly of a protein without pre-existing genetic information. And that there's a technical issue of the rarity of the sequence of amino acids that make a stable protein fold versus all the other ways there are of making amino acids, or of arranging amino acids. Proteins are built from subunits called amino acids. There are roughly 20 separate kinds that will be that are protein forming, and they have to be like like letters in the alphabet to form words. They have to be arranged just so in order to form these protein structures. And it turns out that the rarity of the functional sequences is of such an extreme degree that it's very hard to imagine how you would gradually change one DNA molecule for building a protein into another DNA molecule for building a different protein without falling into a non-functional abyss. So getting from protein to protein in the process of molecular evolution turns out to be prohibitively difficult. And this is a really key issue that's been driving the case for the case against Darwinian evolution and consideration of intelligent design. And there are some new developments in that are showing that the problems for all evolutionary models are even more acute than people realize. So there's a kind of molecular and mathematical challenge to neo-Darwinism. Really technical, but interestingly, I did a podcast with Peter Robinson, who wrote the famous "Mr. Gorbachev, Tear Down This Wall" speech for Ronald Reagan when he was a young speechwriter. He did a podcast with David Galerinter, the chairman or the head of the computer science department at Yale University, David Berlinski, mathematician, and me, about this mathematical challenge to Darwinism. We've had, at last count, 3.8 million views. So even these technical issues are attracting a lot of interest. And so that's something I've been writing about. But we can also talk about the fine-tuning issue that you mentioned in physics. In a way, there's a fine-tuning in biology that even dwarfs what's going on in physics, but fine-tuning is a really crucial issue.
No, let's leave it there. I would encourage people to go to discovery.org. You can subscribe, and then you can be kept informed of what is happening, what is coming up. And of course, Return of the God hypothesis is what I've been fascinated by and enjoying. Signature in the Cells, I really enjoyed that also, the complexity of that. So there's so much available there, but I just encourage the viewers and listeners to head over to discovery.org, make sure to subscribe so you are kept abreast of what is happening. Stephen?
Peter, sorry to interrupt. I just also mentioned that a nice website for entree into this subject is the website that the Institute built for me, called returnofthegodhypothesis.com. If you go there, you can navigate from there to websites to other books, to videos, to animations, to debates, to podcast interviews, and it's a great way to kind of find your way around the contours of this interesting debate.
And if anyone goes to your X Twitter profile, then there is a link to that right in the description, so you can click on it.
You bet.
And go straight there. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Excited by what you're doing and looking forward to watching some of the videos. Sadly, I won't be in Texas in February, but hey,
it's all right.
Look forward to seeing some of the footage and information coming out from it.
We're setting up a new center in Cambridge, England, called the William Whewell Center for Science and Natural Theology. So there's going to be quite a number of events. In fact, we'll have an event on May the 7th that will be advertised as well in Cambridge, a talk on the origin of biological information. And so we'll be doing more things in the UK in the future as well.
I can jump in the car and go there where I can't do to Dallas.
Exactly.
Dallas weather. Yeah. I prefer definitely. But wonderful. We'll keep I'll look out for that and certainly promote that 7th of May. Stephen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Yeah, you bet.